Do you have those people in your life, and maybe you are that person, where you hear them tell the same story over and over and over again? You've heard the story told so much that you could probably say it word for word with them as they told you. And sometimes these people have told you, oh, stop me if I've told you this before. And sometimes you do if you've heard the story before, and they still tell it to you anyway. And other times you will just let them tell the story again, even though you've heard it before. Maybe you've enjoyed the story and it brought you some laughter and joy, and you want to hear it again, or maybe you just don't want to hurt their feelings and allow them to continue, or you think the energy you would spend in telling them that you've already heard this story is not worth being spent, rather just listening to the story once again. And sometimes these stories can be old and stale, and sometimes these stories can be joyful, maybe even life-giving in terms of the bringing joy to the room and some laughter. I had these two elderly uncles, great uncles, who would travel around telling stories when they would meet with the family. They both go visit the family and then tell their stories of the past or what happened the other day at the supermarket or something like that. I remember one particular story, not even word for word, even though I've heard it 1,000 times, but something about potatoes and how they were growing potatoes. And anyway, all these stories that they told. And the thing is, they didn't just tell these stories over and over and over again on separate occasions. They would sometimes repeat themselves within the conversation itself. They would tell you the same story 2 or 3 times, as if it just came to their mind, and oh yeah, did I tell you about, even though you just heard them say it 10 minutes ago, earlier in the conversation. With those kind of stories, they become stale and they become boring, and you just kind of let them happen, especially when they're your elderly great uncles who you are respecting and wanting to know more about, and realize that their reasons are simply to connect. Then there's other times. For example, last week we were together with some friends and sitting around in a circle and just catching up and sharing, but mostly just retelling stories from the past that happened with us as a group of friends, or stories we had shared with each other before that somebody was like, oh, tell about the time that you, or remember when we, and those stories start to come up. And even though everybody in the room, or the majority, has already heard the story, everybody is laughing and enjoying themselves and want to hear the story again and again. And you've told it again and again, and it never becomes boring, because it doesn't become stale, because it's a story that takes you back to a good memory and even brings some joy into the life of the group. So we have been those people. We've entertained those people and had those stories told over and over again. There is the risk that those stories become stale and old hat. And my concern is that some very important stories, some very important histories, become that way with us, where we just think, oh yes, I know, I remember, you told me before, and we dismiss the story. But the truth is, the story is still applicable to our lives today. In particular, I'm talking about the cross. My concern is that the cross is a story that for so many of us has become quite stale. It's a story not just stale to the listeners that maybe have never heard the story before, or maybe they have, but it's also become stale to the ones who tell it. And it's concerning, because this story is meant to bring new life even today. The cross is the single most pivotal moment in human history, not just the Christian faith. but that this is a single most pivotal point in human history. So much so that our calendar revolves around it. And also that we see in the faith, Christian faith, that without this story, our faith would not exist. When we think about the cross, what do we think about? Whether you're a believer or a non-believer, what first comes to mind? What questions arise as you think about the cross? If you are a believer and have been a believer, a follower of Jesus for a long time, when you hear the story of the cross, what do you think? When you hear people talk about the cross, what comes to your mind? And how is the cross continuing to transform the way you live even now? Questions I hope that you'll ponder as we review in Mark chapter 15 together. We're wrapping up chapter 15 and jumping in next time to chapter 16, where we speak on the resurrection, which without the resurrection and the cross together, our faith would not exist. But here we see in Mark chapter 15, verse 22 to 39 is what I'll be reading from for today's purposes. It tells us here that in Mark 15:22, they brought him to a place called Golgotha, and by him I mean Jesus, which means place of a skull. And they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, and he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. And it was the third hour when they crucified him, and the inscription of the charge against him read, "The King of the Jews." And with him they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross that we may see and believe." Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. And when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And some of the bystanders hearing it said, "Behold, he is calling Elijah." And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on a reed, and gave it to him to drink, saying, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to take him down." And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And this curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man is the Son of God." When we hear this story, no matter which gospel we're reading it from or when we have shared it with others from our own remembering, we can allow this story to become quite stale. It's a story that maybe calls us to reverence, calls us to be sober-minded, to stop and reflect and think. But it still is just a story to us sometimes as believers that as we read it, the reality of what it calls us to kind of just falls on deaf ears, even to us, the ones who are called to tell this story. As I consider what it means to follow Jesus, which is one of Mark's primary goals he calls us to throughout his gospel, I recognize that Jesus is calling us to follow him in the cross as well. That we are supposed to see that what is taking place on this cross is meant for all, and that it is meant for all time. That the events that happened over 2,000 years ago were meant to continuously transform us, not just as a one-time event in our lives either, but as a daily reoccurrence of us surrendering ourselves and recognizing what Jesus has done for us, and then living accordingly to what he has called us to live. It's interesting that the Jews stand by and they mock the robbers as well, and I'm sure the Roman soldiers, the centurions. But one stands there and declares something that so far in the Gospel of Mark has only been uttered by God himself, not by any human. So far, we've seen Jesus recognized as the Christ, as a prophet, as a teacher. He references himself as the Son of Man to help paint a picture for those listening and who know the Old Testament, to know what it is that his role is here on earth. But also now we see the centurion declare that Jesus is the Son of God. And it is not until after the veil is torn. In Jesus' death, we see this curtain ripped in two from top to bottom. And this tells us what the meaning of the cross was for. It was that we might be reconciled back to God, that we no longer needed to go to this Holy of Holies where only one person could go in on behalf of a specific nation, but that all, including the Roman centurion, including us, all now had access to God in relationship with him, to be reconciled back to him, to experience freedom in his glory, life in his glory, in his life-giving, everlasting love for us. We can experience that because of what has now taken place on the cross. We ask the question, why the cross in the first place? Why did Jesus have to die? And many skeptics wonder, and many people who ask this question are like, well, if God is so powerful, why did he have to die? Why did blood have to be shed? And there's a lot that I don't even know if I can answer properly on this subject. But what I do know on this is that God has always led us by example. He's always led us in a way that points back to the way he would want us to live out our lives. And by Jesus surrendering himself and humbling himself, even to the point of death, God is calling us to do the same. We read that in Philippians chapter 2 that says, even though Jesus was God, he did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. And so Jesus had humbled himself as God, as the Son of God, even to the point of death on a cross. It was out of his humility and demonstration to humanity what it means to be merciful, to be forgiving, to be loving, even those who have sinned against us, even those who have turned away from us. And he is making the first step here to show us his grace. That is what the cross reveals to us. It is also an opportunity now for Jesus to be defeating death. It shows that, yes, of course, as God, he could snap his finger and death be no more, but it is that he again humbles himself to death's level in a way that he can then defeat death on equal ground. Jesus, death could not contain him. He was God. He is God. And the fact that he died and then rose again is proof that his purpose here was that death would be reversed. That we once were living and then died, and then we once were dead and now living. He reverses what took place in the garden, which we spoke about in Mark chapter 1, when we reviewed the issue of turning from God's ways to our ways. Jesus is reversing what took place there by dying on the cross. Romans chapter 14, verse 9 also says that to this end, that Jesus died so that he could be Lord both of the dead and of the living. So, that says that Jesus had died so that he could be Lord both of the living and the dead. Yes, I had that correct. So Romans chapter 14, verse 9. So the ultimate purpose that Jesus had here was that he would restore us back to the original intent in the garden, that he would die, that we no longer have to die in terms of the curse that was placed in the garden, and that he too would not just be in that moment for those who lived at that time, but for all eternity, God of the living and of the dead. This is not a stale story. The idea that this veil this curtain is torn, that we can now have full access in the presence of God, that he walks with us and wants to be in relationship with us, and that all we have to do is follow Jesus. This is proof of his love for each and every one of us. The cross is not just this stale story that we keep banging to try to get people to be saved. But it's a story that gives us life anew every day for as long as we continue to turn to Jesus and follow him in his ways. One of those ways is that we would humble ourselves and love as he has loved us. That is the call that he places on our lives as his followers, that we would love as he loves us. And in this way, the more that we continue to surrender ourselves to the effects of the cross, the more we will see that this is not just some boring old story, but one that continues giving us life today. When we look in the epistles, the letters in the New Testament written by Paul or by Peter or by John, we see that they reference the cross quite a bit. They continuously point back to the cross and the resurrection of Jesus. And it's in that we see that he is the Son of God. Even in his death, the centurion didn't need to wait until he saw Jesus live again to know that he was the Son of God. But he saw in the manner in which Jesus died, in which he breathed his last, that the centurion looked with awe and said, "Surely, truly, this is the Son of God." Do we still have that response when we consider the manner in which Jesus died? Do we live in that moment? Paul tells us that we can have no life in Christ unless we also share in his death. Throughout Mark, Jesus has been calling us to follow him. Follow him. Follow him where he would lead us. Follow him in his teachings, let's say. But follow him in the way he lived his life, but also in the manner in which he died. Follow him in how we surrender ourselves for the sake of others, that they would know that Jesus is the Son of God, that they would know that they are loved, and that the veil, the curtain, it has been torn, and they can have full access to Jesus. We are called to live lives in this manner. You'll recall that earlier in Mark, James and John had gone to Jesus and asked to sit at his right and left hand in glory in the kingdom. Well, Jesus asked them if they could drink the same cup, if they could be baptized in the same baptism, and they, of course, said yes. What they didn't understand was Jesus was telling them, can you die the same way I will die? Will you suffer the same way I have suffered? Are you willing to give up everything in the same way that I have given up everything? They naively said yes. And I think many of us naively say yes, without counting the cost, without recognizing that discipleship, following Jesus, comes with a heavy weight, one that calls us to surrender ourselves, following Jesus even to the point of death, so that others will know how much they are loved by God. Giving up our rights, not considering ourselves equal to God himself. Certainly not for us, but Jesus himself humbled himself to death, even on a cross. Are we willing to do the same for our fellow human being, not just brother and sister in Christ, but for the Roman centurion who had no part of the faith prior to the veil being torn, and then was welcomed into it and witnessed Jesus' death and said, surely this is the Son of God, surrendering himself right there, confessing that belief right there at the foot of the cross. Can we do the same as we consider what the cross means? When you tell the story of the cross, is there any life change within you? Have you found freedom in it? Has it called you to a humility that Jesus lived? Can you drink from the same cup and be baptized in the same baptism that Jesus was? Can we show people that the veil is torn? Can we show people that they are loved by God and that he is the Son of God? Can we show them that in how we live, in how we follow Jesus, not just for the miracles, not just for the life that he gives, but also for the death that he's called each of us to, by surrendering ourselves, dying to ourselves, leaving our ways behind, and returning, repenting, renewing our minds back to his ways. This is the challenge. Think about how you tell the story of the cross. Think about, does it have any impact or weight in your own life? And how is that going to change the way you live and tell that story to others? God bless your week, and we'll see you whenever.